All right. Thank you, everyone. And this is the fourth panel of today on information, disinformation, and education. And I'm Elizabeth Fussell, Beth, and I am a professor of population studies, environment, and society, and the co-director of Equitable Climate Futures. So, like in the other panels, we're going to have 3 rounds of questions. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different order. And that will go for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have another 40 or so minutes of questions. And afterwards, we'll close the meeting and have a networking reception. So I hope you all are able to stick around for that. We will be winding up at around 5:15. But before I go on to the questions, I want to just briefly mention that we've had a change in the program. We were going to have Kate Shapiro come, but she had a family emergency and is not able to participate in the panel. And instead, we have Kristen Reed, who is her community partner in the Warren Health Equity Zone. And so this makes her the only community partner who we have asked to be on a panel, because what we wanted to do in this conference was to encourage communication and learning among researchers about how to do community engaged research. We didn't want the community partners to be teaching everyone how to do that. Instead, we wanted to learn from one another so that we can be prepared to engage with community partners. So Kristen has agreed to participate, and we're really glad. Thank you so much for filling in, because the project that you and Kate have been doing with the Warren Health Equity Zones is a great example of community engaged research. Okay, so we also have, in addition to Kristen, we have Katya. Sorry, I'm not putting up. Katya, I just met you. I don't see you, but there you are. Can you just stand up and say, and tell me your last name again? Manson. Okay, Katya Manson is also here from the Warren Health Equity Zone. So thank you for being here. All right, so our first question is going to Matt Kraft. And so I'm starting off the first round of questions asking people what their motivation for studying climate change is. So Matt, I'm going to ask you a question, but when you answer it, please introduce yourself, and you can refer to your project as well. So Matt, you've spent your career studying how to improve the effectiveness of K through 12 educators in schools. So what made you want to start researching climate change in education systems?
Thanks very much, Beth. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt, and I am an economist of education, and most of my career has been focused on teaching and learning in K-12 public schools. I was a public school teacher, a substitute teacher, and have focused on teacher labor markets and school organizational practices, state and federal policy. And it was not until very recently that I began to think about the intersection of climate change and environmental pressures with education policy and practice. And I was inspired by the previous panel's examples of other disciplines intersecting with these topics. I would never have guessed that I would be sitting here today, even a couple years ago. I think there are several factors that led me to be here. Some were that in my own work, it was unavoidably obvious that extreme weather events were putting pressure on schools and impacting teachers' ability to do their jobs effectively, both from the trauma and economic impacts on the students, if they were able to come to school, and in some extreme cases with wildfires or hurricanes or wildfire smoke, even schools just not able to operate, to perform their basic functions. And that was all kind of evident to me. But I think that there are challenges in academia when you have invested a lot of years in a particular area of expertise and research, and you've developed networks, and then all of a sudden you think, well, I'm going to jump out of that little pond that I know people and have established a career in and move to a new one. And so I hadn't yet been willing to take that kind of plunge until one night about 4 years ago, when my now sixth grader was a second grader, and I was putting him to bed. And in that twilight moment, right before he fell asleep, he kind of turned over in a haze, and out of the blue, based on no conversation we had ever had, said, "Dad, global warming is bad. What are we going to do about it?" And it floored me. Like this, to this day, it's hard for me to even express the degree to which I had absolutely no answer, or even a vision of how to approximate an answer. And I think that for me personally was the nudge, the kind of personal connection that I needed to see, to be brave enough to take that plunge and pivot. And it also is, I think, a great example of why education needs to be part of this conversation, because it was my son's second grade teacher, who was a former biotech engineer who pivoted careers to then be an elementary school teacher, who took her own initiative to integrate more science education into the second grade curriculum, and that led to that conversation that we had at home. And so here I am today. I am the faculty director and founder of the Sustainable Education Research Initiative, which I'm happy to share more about, or Sustainable Ed, housed at the Annenberg Institute. And we are doing a range of projects trying to map out and advance research at the intersection of education and climate change.
Thank you, Matt. Wow, I just want to say, there was no preview to that story. And for some people, like myself, it took a hurricane to get me to do this. For others, just a bedtime routine. That's amazing. So, Kristen, can you tell me about the journey that led you to collaborate with Kate Shapira on Where Warren Meets the Water?
Certainly. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Reed. I am the project lead or the director of the Warren Health Equity Zone, often abbreviated to HEZ. And my agency is East Bay Community Action Program. Forgive me, I need notes so that I can stay on track. So Warren HEZ was established in 2021. The third round of HEZs. There are 14 HEZs here in Rhode Island. And it was established in 2021 when the town of Warren and East Bay Community Action Program partnered on an application to the Rhode Island Department of Health. I was their first staff, and I recognized that I had unique skills, experiences, and perspectives, and I was a resident. And in Warren, it's like who you know, everybody knows somebody. And it's worse in a teeny tiny town. And so my first career was as a museum educator. I was tasked with developing relationships and programs that ensured everybody was welcome in a museum. For some folks, museums were not part of their culture, couldn't afford it, whatever the barriers might have been. and was proud to be part of programs such as making sure that STEM careers were something that we nurtured for youth who were Black and brown students. And so really steeped in access and inclusion through that role. My second career, I know I look young, right? My hair fools everybody. But my second career centered on national service here in Rhode Island. And through AmeriCorps and VISTA, I placed members in colleges, museums, health centers, and childcare. Many of these members use this to enter a new field or to join the workforce. Here in Providence, lots of folks who came from another country with an education degree but couldn't use it, and AmeriCorps was a way for them to come into the schools, represent the students and the families that were there. And so this really brought community new capacity. So this third phase or career in public health is the framework for the HES. So HES is an initiative of the Rhode Island Department of Health. There are 14 HESs in Rhode Island. They are health equity centered, place-based, community-led, and focus on social determinants of health. So that place-based is really critical as we all are have different types of obstacles or challenges or solutions that impact our health and wellness. And social determinants of health, in this case, think of them as root causes for health inequity, such as access to education, good quality jobs, safe housing, healthy food, and the ability to participate sort of in your politics, in your decision making. And that's really what this program grew from. So Kate Shapira, faculty here, writing faculty member, approached the town manager and the HES offering to support community members who would be impacted by something called Market to Medicom. So you see up here the Market Street neighborhood, and the reality is that we're already experiencing some pretty significant flooding. And sea level projections in the next 30 years have, some of the households being inundated. And of course, if there was not inundated, but the high tide mark being, closer to your front yard than your backyard. And with a significant storm, there'd be property damage and so on and so forth. And so she proposed a workshop where Warren meets the water. And her goal was that residents could participate more fully by having in determining and being part of this Market to Medicom plan, which I apologize, would have the market part is to relocate neighbors, and the Medicom part is to create some new housing. So they were really going to do the plan is for a managed retreat. And of course, this would impact this neighborhood dramatically. And so how could neighbors come together, build some strategies for coping, and together construct a vision that included climate change? So at the end of the session, that first, we did a 3-part series, was kind of sold out. And at the end of the session, we had participants committing to meeting monthly, creating their first action plan. We're going to work on biking. We're going to use our strength in taking care of each other for emergency. And we're going to talk and think and take action around climate change. And we're in our 3rd cycle of that series. We have a robust work group. And we've had a lot of participation from Kate and her students through a class called Writing for Change. Oops, sorry.
Great, thank you, Kristen. So we'll hear more about this, about where Warren meets the water in the next questions. So Rachel, you've researched the framings of climate change in American mainstream media for most of your career. Can you tell us what drew you to that topic?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Rachel Wetz. I'm a professor at IBIS and in sociology. And I study broadly American politics, American racial politics, and American climate change politics, especially. And I look particularly at sort of the interaction between sort of cultural and social psychological processes on the part of the American public and then the interventions of powerful organizations and political elites in sort of swaying the way that these political issues unfold. And what drew me to, absolutely, yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm gesticulating and my voice is cutting in and out. But yeah, so part of what drew me to this topic, like many of the people in this room, and as Matt shared so powerfully, is essentially a sort of normative political commitment and care, right, about this issue, about climate change. And a desire to use my career to contribute in some way, right, to addressing the climate crisis. So as a political sociologist, I felt that one way that I could potentially do that is sort of understanding the social factors leading to stalled political action on this issue, right? And for me, I thought that there was a bit of a puzzle there in the fact that, while we know that the impacts of climate change are unevenly distributed, right, that they are impacting poor countries and poor people across nations disproportionately, the impacts are also somewhat universalistic and widely shared, right? This is a huge issue impacting many folks across the globe from a range of social backgrounds, from a range of political orientations, right? And that kind of relatively universalistic distribution of impacts of climate change, in theory, you would think, might lead to a relative amount of social consensus to address the issue. But clearly, that's not what we see, right? Dramatically, that is not what we see. So, what's going on there? So this drew me to wanting to better understand, issues of power and how power differentials among different groups in American politics have shaped the climate change debate in ways that have sort of blocked that kind of consensus from forming. So my hope is that, my research can sort of help better understand the factors that have shaped the climate change debate in a way that has blocked that political action, and that this greater understanding could potentially help sort of social movements, advocates interested in addressing this issue to combat those forces, right? So I'll talk more later about the sort of specific project I've done to try to better understand that, but for now, that's sort of what's led me here.
Thanks, Rachel. Stefanie, most of your work is focused on information ecosystems and health outcomes, particularly during the pandemic. So how did you become interested in climate change, and what connections do you see between the pandemic and climate change in terms of information ecosystems?
Thank you so much. Thank you guys all for being here. This is like the last panel before the cheese and the crackers. So thanks for sticking it out with us. Excited to be here. Stefanie Friedhoff, I'm a professor of the practice. So a fairly newly minted, somewhat academic. I used to be part of the problem. I'm a long-term journalist and have covered climate for, since, 1995, before we started to talk about it in this way. So given all these wonderful introductions, I think I should start there, and then I'll talk about the pandemic, because in 2004, for example, after moving to the US as a European, I very quickly organized a conference for all my journalist friends to bring in some climate scientists for us to get educated on what was actually going on. And these frameworks differ so by culture and by the different systems that we come from. So yes, I look at the world through the lens of information ecosystems, by which we mean all the different ways in which people today get their information about whatever it is that they need and want to know about, information that helps them manage their lives. And that includes, how do we stay safe from the health threats of climate change, or in general, the threats from climate change, and a host of other things. And the pandemic connection here is that the pandemic showed so drastically how the communications approaches that are applied by our governmental organizations, but also by many nonprofits, are just really painfully out of date. And in that context, in the pandemic, we saw so many mistakes, right? We had a fast-moving public health crisis that's also an economic crisis, that's also a social crisis. It was, evidence changes all the time, and it is incredibly important to stay in touch and connect with the public. And we did that in not so great ways. We're all suffering the consequences to some extent. So when we think about how we are addressing the climate crisis and how we are able to engage broad parts of the public, not just those that are already in the boat, it is really essential to me. Communications is an essential part of that, and approaching communications from a 21st century perspective, understanding our chaotic, weaponized, attention-grabbing information spaces, as opposed to thinking about which specific message can I use to reach this specific person about this one thing. So within the context of that, at the Information Futures Lab, so coming out of the work we did in the pandemic, we started the Information Futures Lab at the School of Public Health, where we think a lot about these issues, and are working really at the intersection of the climate crisis and the information crisis that we have, that is eroding both major achievements in health and our democratic infrastructure. So the little slide I put up here, or the little bar here, is from a project that we run. It's called the STAT Network. We work with state public health folks across the country. So those are the people that are actually currently in charge of creating the response plans, of preparing the extreme weather responses, of informing people about the risks and where to find a cooling center and how to pay for your electricity bill, all those types of things. In this specific survey, which is data from 34 states, equal distribution in terms of political leanings of these states, it is very clear that by and large, our authorities know that their communications approaches are not working. So here you can see that 84%, right, say that it's either moderately or slightly working. And, very effective is like 12%. So there's a great acknowledgement amongst anybody, and we have the same with the community organizations who we work with, that everybody knows it's not working, but why and what it is that we can do better. And one way to think about this is that we have outdated skill sets. So a lot of people aren't trained on how to operate in the new information environment. And then we have really problematic infrastructure. 25 years after the internet first came about, I would argue, as somebody who has worked as a journalist before there was an internet, it is harder to find information today than it was 25 or 30 years ago, when you just call somebody and they would actually pick up. And you could work your way, and that is why community-based work is so important, because you can still talk to somebody and you go from person to person until you find your answer. But that is the environment in which we are in, and in order to make progress on these really important issues, we need to and want to have a better understanding of how to do that. I'll give you one other example. So the ecosystem perspective is really important, because we do this work with authorities, we do this work at the community level, but we also look at what is happening on the internet. And in one study specifically, we looked at how are folks currently talking about climate and health in our online information spaces. So TikTok, Facebook, but also news headlines. And we found that in the overall body of content that we looked at over an 18-month period, only 3.1% of the overall content that mentioned the word climate change, climate crisis, global warming, only 3.1% of that had anything to do with health. So we're really not utilizing the health lens to begin with. But whenever organizations, both climate and health organizations, did that, all they talked about was doom and gloom. We are leaving massive opportunities on the table. We are not talking about action enough. We are not using storytelling enough. And the most striking finding to me from this work remains, we're using almost no conservative framings for this work. So we're already assuming that an important part of the population doesn't even want to be engaged. So there are many, many solutions out there, right? It's very easy to feel overwhelmed with this, again, attention-grabbing, monster that is social media. There are many things we can do, and that's the kind of work that we're excited about.
Thanks, Stefanie. I'm going to go a little bit out of order, because I think there's some important points that Stefanie raised that might articulate well with Kristen's project in Warren, because Stefanie mentions about actually talking to people, telling stories. How do you change the narrative to a particular audience? Can you, Kristen, tell us a little bit about, maybe respond a little bit to what those prompts that Stefanie put up, and tell us how things are going in Warren?
Sure. So we are fortunate. The HES community has benefited from Stefanie and her team doing some workshops with us, gathering some information from us, because I think you might think of the HESs as these, there's not county level health agencies. Sometimes we are the place where people are coming to figure out how to get information or distribute masks and self-test kits to make sure that everybody has them. And so we've been so thankful for the partnership that we've gotten from Stefanie, and she knows a little bit about what we do. So, the town of Warren is about 11,000 people, and we are surrounded by water, and lots of neighborhoods are dealing with flooding, not just the Market Street neighborhood. However, the Market Street neighborhood is in large part renters. It's three family, like 3-story walk-ups, housing that was originally for our manufacturing history. And so back to that idea of that map, it's not just the number of houses, it's the number of households. And it's a significant number of households that might be needing to be relocated or to find a new place away from their network, away from their systems. And so, having them have good information and an outlet was really what we were hoping to do around resiliency. And to Stefanie's point, I think, one of the first things we learned is that the town communicates by putting ads in a newspaper. Like they put it in a newspaper you have to buy, that nobody reads anymore, truly. And so we thought, well, we're going to help with community engagement. Most of what we see from the community is that they're getting their information word of mouth, right? They're getting it from their neighbors, and certainly on the internet. And these popular narratives are so big that it's hard to move them or find how you get in. You just instantly sort of defeated. And so, I think our goal was to break this down and think about how to reach people. And so the workshop series that I mentioned before, the first one, Where Warren Meets the Water, really formed the basis for a work group, a platform for residents to come together and share concerns with each other, share strategies with each other, a place to get information or ask for information. And it turned into a work group, right? So we meet monthly. We have agendas that are, come from the community, but are facilitated, with a community, a champion, and we are, sort of constantly taking information in and figuring out what our action plan might be from there. The group has built some strong connections with each other, and a goal is to increase connection and communication sort of street by street so that people are ready for emergencies. I mean, we've talked on things like who can spare some space in their fridge or might have a grill, who can take my dog when a storm strikes, because again, these are renters, it's just, they just don't have as much sort of backup strategy as others might have. Neighbors have taught each other about how to move mechanicals from the basement to the next floor up so that you have less property loss, or how they've worked on getting their flood insurance down, because some folks don't have flood insurance at all, right? But are living in that neighborhood. Town officials, we've found that town officials and other committees are coming to us now that this group is 3 years in, and asking for people support, asking for feedback, just being sort of like a first draft with us. And this group did not exist before these pieces started to come together, but it is a vital place where people are getting information. The Kate Shapira's group has as students, undergrad and grad, have helped with doing some documentation, some research, implementing their thesis, thinking about how to get people to take action, not get stalled, and they've listened. They've done listening sessions on our bike path, for example, and collected information. And it just feels like we are more visible. You know, there's increased participation, and certainly in these decision-making spaces that is not at the town council, which is very, intimidating and time. There's not enough time to even find out what the word was that they just shared. So there's these increased informal places where we're connecting. And I think the town has benefited in terms of resiliency. They have lived experience to guide their decisions, and individuals have some strategies for increasing their own resiliency, but it needs to be the town, and it needs to be neighbors taking care of neighbors, not just all on the one resident trying to figure things out. And so I see where we are more resilient in that way. And I think one painful moment of time where all of our funding sort of structures has shifted, and the town was relying on FEMA dollars to start that managed retreat to take some houses and let that rewild, and then more houses and create a greater buffer. And I feel there's not a lot of research into this yet, but I feel like residents have a larger picture now, the ones that are part of our group, of the components that are involved in something like a market to Metacom plan. And so they're pivoting. They're able to ask for questions now and support and advocate for the receiving area. So we housing is a hot topic, and we know we need more housing in Warren as everywhere. And then also trees as infrastructure. Trees seem to be a neutral and important thing. So, how are trees being used to reduce heat, clean air, and store water, again in that Market Street neighborhood, which hasn't had a lot of infrastructure brought into it, as they were sort of imagining that it was going to shift, and in some cases, really transform.
So I'm going to move to Rachel now. So Rachel, the innovation of your research is the use of computational methods to analyze large amounts of textual data and discern the framings of climate-related content in the mainstream news media. So how do you think your findings contribute to a solution or addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, thank you. So in my research, I've investigated this question of sort of whose voices and which perspectives are given mainstream media visibility in the US climate change debate, and why, right? So I ask especially like how the economic power of different interest groups compares to the cultural power of the climate messages that people are putting out in sort of determining whose voices get heard in the American climate change debate. And part of the reason I think this question is important is because sort of, as we all know, there are some incredibly economically powerful interest groups present in this debate, right? As well as many others with fewer material resources seeking to get their voices heard. So understanding how both sort of material resources and culture matter can help sort of understand the possibilities and constraints faced by these very different types of groups, right? Like if I found that like material resources alone are really determinative of message visibility, that would be a finding that would suggest that groups like Koch Industries are always just going to have an upper hand in this debate, right? Whereas if I found that like sort of cultural power was important, that could provide a way for groups with less material resources to sort of access media visibility to get their voices out there, potentially change the debate, right? So to answer that question, I used computational text analysis to describe a large sample of press releases put out by business organizations, social advocacy groups, government agencies, to sort of just understand what messages they're trying to put out there about climate change. And then I used plagiarism detection software to see which of those messages got picked up in all articles published about climate change in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the USA Today from 1985 to 2014. So that's sort of like, that allowed me to sort of see like, what are people trying to say? What is the sort of cultural resonance of the potential messages they're trying to say? And then what determines who actually gets heard, right, in these mainstream media sources? And of course, everything is different now with social media. That's, of course, something I can talk about later. But yeah, so among sort of other findings from this project, I found that sort of structurally powerful interest groups, such as business coalitions and large businesses, have received sort of disproportionate media attention in the US climate change debate. And by structurally powerful, I mean that these are sort of groups who are perceived as having an important impact on the economy, right? Like you can think of like the Detroit auto manufacturers, right? So they're a large employer who employs people in a very specific region. So if they sort of change locations, downsize, close a facility due to, say, a particular climate policy being implemented, that would have impacts on lots of people. So groups like those large employers are given increased visibility in the climate change debate at the same level as the government itself receives visibility, and potentially because of these impacts, these economic impacts that these groups would have on the sort of larger macroeconomy. And opponents of climate action have received disproportionate visibility as well. They're about twice as likely to make the news as proponents and advocates of climate action. But on the sort of positive side of that, I also find that economic resources alone really aren't the only factor that matters, right? First, just having sort of more assets, more revenue, those kinds of sort of bare minimum types of economic resources are not determinative of political messages' success. And political messages are also more likely to receive media coverage when they leverage sources of cultural power, such as by sort of appealing to latent worldviews of American audiences. So we can think of like American rational individualism as a sort of broad-based cultural narratives where organizations can sort of tune their messages to try to appeal to sort of an individualistic way of understanding the world rather than sort of referring to climate. For example, like you could refer to climate change as a sort of impersonal or structural problem, as sociologists will tend to do. Or you could identify specific powerful actors as the groups that are sort of causing the problem. And that more individualistic framing of saying, these are the bad guys, these are the ones who are causing this problem, is the type of framing that leads messages to be more culturally resonant and to receive more visibility. So I guess my findings sort of have these sort of two sides of saying, well, yes, these sort of powerful industries and organizations do have an upper hand in the climate change debate and shaping what gets heard. On the other hand, there are these sort of cultural paths to media visibility that provide an alternative, though constrained, right, path to influence for people seeking social change.
Great, thank you. That's really insightful. Turning now to Matt. So can you tell us about the goals of the Sustainable Education Research Initiative and how those goals will advance solutions to mitigate climate change or promote adaptation to climate change?
Great. I think it's helpful to just kind of lay a baseline mapping of, even if we only focus on K-12 public schools in the United States, which is just a fraction of the broader, P to 20 educational infrastructure and pipeline. We're talking about over 100,000 schools serving upwards of 48 million students that operates one of the largest public transportation fleets in the country, over 500,000 buses. In its infrastructure alone, not counting the more than 4 billion meals it serves over the course of an academic year, emits the equivalent to roughly the amount of exhaust produced by 15 million cars over the course of a year, or the equivalent of 18 coal-fired power plants. and operates on over 2 million acres of land. So they were a major land steward in this country as well. And so if we narrowly cast the intersection of education and climate change in the kind of infrastructure space, there is an important contribution that public infrastructure in our education system plays in both its contribution to carbon emissions, as well as a market leader in shaping demand for alternative infrastructure investments. Call it, LEED certified buildings or other types of more sustainable and resilient investments. That, I think, is an easy entree into understanding why we might think about education and climate change. But I think we need to open the aperture of our lens more widely. And so at Sustainable Ed, we're broadly thinking about 5 overall areas of intersection, both the impact of schools on climate and the environment, but also the converse, how, of course, climate change and increasingly frequent and severe extreme weather events or more chronic pressures like high heat and air pollution affect students' ability to learn. And a third bucket, thinking about what we as an education system prepare students to understand about the environment and their relationship with nature. A fourth bucket, how we are training the future workforce that will inherit the ways in which the economy is evolving due to climate change, and are they equipped with the skills that the new demands that solving that challenge will require us to meet. And then the final one, thinking more broadly, almost from a sociological lens about the role of schools as cornerstone cultural institutions in a society and what they play as a part of a community. And so along those 5 buckets, we've kind of put out a literature synthesis and a research agenda as our first kind of mapping of this intersectional space, kind of call to action. And our 3 areas that we're hoping to contribute are, 1, advancing original, rigorous research at this intersection to help directly inform policy and practice. 2, to help to build the connective tissue of a network and community of scholars across disciplines, as well as policymakers and practitioners who would, in dialogue with those researchers, help to advance the body of knowledge we have to draw on to inform education policy. And 3rd, to develop the tools and resources that both researchers may need to advance this work, as well as practitioners through translational work of research and syntheses, as well as something as simple as a school-specific diagnostic report of climate risks and proximity to other environmental hazards, toxins, local carcinogens from legacy industrial sites. And so we're in our kind of early nascent phases. We have been so grateful for the support of IBIS and the Catalyst Research Award with the Office of Sustainability and Resiliency, but in particular just of folks in this room and in the broader group of scholars here at Brown who have been really willing to answer our kind of naive questions of, we don't understand this. And it's a bit liberating to be at that stage where we can just ask the basic questions that maybe kind of others who are steeped in this knowledge may not be thinking about because they've kind of passed that stage of kind of initial understanding and mapping. We, in addition to the scoping of the existing literature and call for research action, have been moving to do some just baseline descriptive work before we move towards more causally identified analyses of the impacts of some of these climate pressures. My colleague, Sohail Mullick, and I, along with Grace Falcon, we've got a poster here, which I hope you can swing by and check out, that just is about mapping the overall landscape of proximity of EPA registries of Superfund sites, brownfields, and toxic release inventory sites with our public and private K-12 education infrastructure. And what we hope to do is to just see the conversation in the education policy environment, which in our view has yet to see this topic of environmental pressures and climate change as central to the work of supporting teachers and students in teaching and learning.
Thank you, Matt. So back to you, Stefanie. So can you tell us more about the STAT network, of which you're the lead investigator? So, and specifically, can you focus your comments on how the network is changing public health information about climate change?
And I think we're merging maybe questions, given that we're coming up on time. Can I give an example? I'm excited to share an example.
Oh, yeah. Talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Yes. Taken license. I'm just coming off the reason why I had to miss some of the prior sessions. We just had our Extreme Weather and Health Network session. So think about, in all the 50 states around the country, there's teams in our public health departments that are thinking about how are these shifting climates changing how we need to prepare, how we need to plan, how we protect people from the impact. This includes extreme weather, it includes wildfires, it includes a whole host of issues. And the history here is that the Obama administration provided some original funding for this type of work. Then the pandemic happened, so the work was really deprioritized. Then everybody said, okay, pandemic's over, let's go do this, Inflation Reduction Act. And we're now in a space where not just the money, but the entire infrastructure has gone away for a lot of this work, the data infrastructure, the communications infrastructure. So we are in the position with the STAT network to convene all these folks across the country for information sharing. How are you navigating? What are you doing? And as I mentioned earlier, we've now been doing this for the past year, and we are finding that there's 3 things that stick out. One is we need to radically and differently collaborate in this environment, especially in and with our communities. The other is obviously we need to figure out how we redo the data, because some of the data sets are going away, and again, states and local municipalities are innovating in that space. And the third is communication. Like, this is very clearly work that depends on people knowing what's going on, both for mitigation and for adaptation. So the call today we had was about data for community engagement. So for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, there is a data tool called the Environmental Justice Scan, which takes a couple of indicators and puts together an understanding of where in the state are the highest environmental justice risk, meaning where are the most vulnerable populations, and where's an opportunity for action. And what is so inspiring about this example is that the governor and the leadership team said, okay, great, we are now going to hire a political organizer who is going to run a project for us based on the communities that are most vulnerable, going door to door. Let's go all the way on the ground and let's bring people into a town hall. Let's do listening. Let's do all the different things to understand how we can bring people into the conversation. What are some of the things that they found? For example, in some of the communities, the people who were not Black and brown felt this wasn't for them, because it had been framed in that environmental justice had been framed in that way. And they realized that while those communities remain most at risk, that doesn't mean that we cannot include everybody else in this conversation. And by going door to door, they reached entirely different parts of their communities, which are sort of, again, partnering in some places, fighting in other places, right? It is community-based work, so everything is in the mix. But they have had great success leading a process by which then in these different municipalities, for example, similar to how the HESs are working, creating local governance infrastructure and bringing those community leaders to be part of the development and the decision-making process, for example, on permitting of buildings and so forth. So the way that the STAD network works is that we connect people across, and we had a different, equally inspiring story today that we learned about how Oklahoma City has been doing a heat map, has discovered a lot of things about Oklahoma City is the size of Boston, Washington, a number of large cities together is huge, and 50% of it is asphalt, right? It is the American heartland. And the heat island issues are really severe. They discovered, people, men over 75 are at highest risk in that community and in that population. So same thing, they're using the data as a segue into conversation, as a segue into action, as a segue into building relationships, all based on the understanding that a social media post is not going to help you reach the 75-year-old man who may not be using. So a lot of these issues, some of you are familiar with some of the narratives, but the issues are the majority of cases of heat mortality, for example, is not because people don't have an AC, it is because they're not using the AC because they're trying to save money. And that goes back to these both the structural issues and so forth. So the STAT network helps elicit these examples and make connections and scaling these solutions that are already happening, especially in how we're connecting the response efforts with trust building and community-based work past a messaging approach.
Thank you. And I do think we're a little bit behind schedule because you guys have been telling great stories, and I know I asked you all to tell your stories. And so I want to just do a kind of really fast last round where we can just go from Matt to Stefanie. And I want you to, I'd like for you to share like one highlight from the work that you've been doing in this area around climate change, something that you feel really proud of and you think others would appreciate knowing. I know this is, I'm popping this, so you don't have to go in order. Whoever thinks of it first, just go.
Briefly, I'll just say that it's been really encouraging to have raised a flag of, are you interested in the environment and climate change as an education researcher or practitioner? And I've had so many people that I do not know raise their hand high and say, I've been looking for a space. I'm so excited that there's a community that's going to come together and have these discussions. And that has been really both affirming and hopeful in my sense that there's just a latent and potentially untapped kind of coalition of practitioners, policymakers, researchers who see this as important but have yet to find a place where there's a collective voice that they share that can kind of amplify everyone's individual work.
Yeah, I think what we're most proud of is brought to also by work that Brown and Kate has brought to us, but we are really addressing climate anxiety, right? So we start each meeting, workshop, whatever it is, with a grounding exercise. We start and end with a moment where we're breathing, we've closed our eyes. This is a very strange and awkward thing to do with like DPW workers, but it is very unifying. We're able to sort of center, remember, that we're here and that we can listen, because we have a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different understandings of what the problem is or what the solution might be. And I think that that skill set is something that's going to go forward into other discussions, other opportunities for discourse, and we have to be able to stay with our heads above the ground, or we just can't think it's somebody else's problem. So.
Yeah, not so much something I'm proud of as something I'm grateful for and excited about is just, the Climate Social Science Network at Brown, right? That Timmons Roberts started with Bob Brule, and that was sort of just launching right when I joined Brown about 6 years ago. And I feel like is sort of relevant to this conversation because it's all about interdisciplinarity, right? There it's just the social sciences, but that's hard enough, right? If you're talking about psychologists and anthropologists and economists all talking together. And so through that group, I've been able to sort of join a working group of scholars from across the social sciences, from across many different nations, who meet regularly to talk about issues of power in the climate change debate. And it's really exciting to have that kind of opportunity. And even just within that, social science interdisciplinarity has been really helpful for my research and thinking about like, what's the working day of a journalist like? That's not something I know, but my colleagues in communications and media studies and journalism like know that really, really well. So that alone is just something that I'm grateful for and happy exists here.
Yeah, I'll continue with the theme of grateful. I mean, I brought some flyers here for anybody who wants to know. We just put out a report about the state of climate and health work at the state and local level across the country, which was amazing in part. Here's something I'm really grateful for. You produce something with 48 of 50 states participating, and you send it back to them because you have to always have them read it and approve. And they all had almost no edits. I was like, this is great. So between Texas and Florida and Massachusetts and California, I was like, okay, that's a win. Anything a journalist would never do. But the other quick story I wanted to tell that feels meaningful and important to this moment is that I just had an opportunity to facilitate a dialogue in Oklahoma City, unrelated to the earlier story, where we were talking about healthy communities, healthy economies, and it is an effort by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Heartland Foundation, to lean into the heartland and to build broader coalition. Many of you may know that the Rockefeller Foundation has moved its entire portfolio toward climate change, mostly globally, or mostly work in the climate change space, mostly globally, but is leaning back into the US again after the pandemic, given the current environment. And in this conversation, there was a ultra-conservative hospital executive. There was the first Black farmer in Oklahoma who is working on food security and climate-related and justice issues. There was just such an amazing group of strange bedfellows in the room. It was raw. People were crying, but it was a dialogue. And I felt that this is the kind of conversation that we need to be having. Again, I'd be happy to share more details, but just even being able to facilitate that conversation and to draw out people in their differences in a way that is civil and that allowed us to see that nobody wants their wife to die in childbirth because our rural hospitals are dying. Right? We can all agree that food is a basic need that everybody should have access to. There was, you could draw out these agreements. And again, this cross-silo work, like this is all connected. The climate work is connected to the food security work, is connected to the housing work, right? And so forth.
Great. Thank you all. Kara, do we have any questions from Zoom?
Nor ask this question to the earlier panel. We didn't have time, but I think it actually applies more to this panel, potentially. What's one effective way to counter climate misinformation in schools or communities? You've all talked a little bit about that, but.
It's really interesting when you ask teachers about their experiences, and I'm not just talking about a science teacher, I'm talking about cross disciplines, teaching about the ways in which climate change or climate change is, other elements that are more directly the impacts it's causing, that it's the antecedent to. It is a topic that is certainly politicized, and that can create tensions between what students hear outside of school in their community or at home and what teachers are introducing. But I think there is a broad sense that there's a lot of ways to access a dialogue around common grounds when it's centered on a very localized level. And so instead of talking about this abstract macro issue, let's just talk about the weather in our community, the local flooding challenges that we're facing, the proximity to that local power plant and which school is there and who attends that school. And that, I think, grounds the conversation into just simple facts that people can see and creates a window for conversation. I think another piece of this is not about kind of how we teach, but about what we teach. In most U.S. high schools, in contrast to math and English, we only require 3 rather than 4 years of science for high school graduation. And that often leaves environmental science out in the cold as an elective that a very few number of our secondary students actually take. And that's the course more so than any, sometimes it's called kind of planetary sciences and other things, but that has a curriculum that more so than anything introduces students to these types of topics. And I think this is fundamental, and this is an area that we're excited to explore more deeply, in part because there's ample evidence across kind of more broad context that the more exposure you have to an academic discipline or an area of interest in your K-12 education, the more likely you are to pursue that as a major in college and as an ultimate career. And if we are trying to build our STEM labor force to come up with creative solutions to these challenges, then it matters about what we teach and what we build as a curriculum.
There or not? Okay, my top 5. Since we dabble in misinformation at the lab. First, build relationships. Connection over correction. There has been an overweight on trying to be the smartass as the party who knows the better facts. That is not an effective approach for anything, let alone building understanding in people. It is not how we would teach in our classrooms either. It's not how we should teach our, sort of treat our friends, family members, community members. Don't assume, ask, and listen. We have so many assumptions about people. Often there's all kinds of other reasons. And we think people, and one phrase we use a lot is like, people are actually experts in their own lives. And we don't get to decide about that. And that includes the health stories. And when we listen to people's health stories, then we discover different truth, and we can understand why some of the narratives might be so effective in connecting with people and where we are failing to connect with people. Ask people about their experiences, not their opinions. So that's a really important one because we can exchange opinions until we're blue in the face. Sorry, I'm really activated today. So some of that German energy coming out. But right, we can like argue about anything. It is irrelevant until it actually matters in our own lives. So ask about experiences. There's a marvelous story right now that I'm fascinated by. Craig Spencer from the School of Public Health went to the Children's Health Defense Robert F. Kennedy's anti-vax groups conference. A conservative satirical writer wrote a Time story about it. Somebody in the conservative world wrote like the counter story making fun of him. He said, hey, this is actually really funny. She said, oh, what, you're responding? I find that kind of cool. He says, yeah, why don't we have a conversation? So they have a Zoom call, and the Zoom call is online. What you see in the comments, so me and my team, we spend a lot of time in the comments of this universe. And what you see in the comments between her first post, ridiculing him, it's all ridicule, yada, yada. And then second, people start talking about their experiences. They come out of this conversation disagreeing on a lot of things, but her headline is, he's actually a great human being. And what you see is that the conversation is changing, and we need to do that in the micro. We need to change these conversations by, like, what have you experienced that got you here? This is like one of the really important things. And I could go on, but be out there and share stories.
Okay. Any questions from the in-person audience?
Yeah. So I'm a little loud, so. I love all your work. I work in so many different departments. I work in the emergency room. I now serve on the school board. I work with PRP, so I have, but all of your experience, it's perfect, and it brings me back that we have our speakers programs that we want to start in Watershed Council, and we would love for you guys to come and talk to our community, because there's a lot of information that we don't get. There's a lot of resources. This university has so many grant fundings, and people don't know. Our community don't know. So how do we gonna, climate change is also about getting the information to people in community. And I live in Olneyville. 70% of our community are Spanish speaking. And it's not because we have a program called New Voices. A lot of our residents don't know about climate change, about the history of Providence. So, in other words, I'm asking you to come to us in Providence and work with our WRWC and Novas Voces, and also the Resilient Hub. We have the first Resilient Hub in Providence. And yeah, we would like to collaborate. We would like to, all of you guys to come to us, because that's the only way we could start talking with our kids about climate change. I have a set of twins who are really worried about climate change, or about AI, worried about so many things. So yes, so how do we collaborate more, in other words?
I have an idea. How about a working group?
So on climate misinformation, I always assumed that it was largely being driven by moneyed interests, Exxon and so on, these powerful entities. But the anti-vax movement makes me question that, because that doesn't seem to be obviously driven by money, but is still seems to be a compelling narrative. And measles vaccines are basically perfect, nearly as perfect as you could expect, and yet people are rejecting them. So does the anti-vax movement have something to teach us about what's going on with climate misinformation?
I'm certainly not an expert on the anti-vax movement, but I have a few things to say in response. Is that I think that's a very interesting case in terms of the sort of differences in terms of the sources. of where misinformation is coming from. In the case of the climate change debate, we do know that there was a vast investment by moneyed interests into creating this misinformation, into funding contrarian scientists, et cetera, right? But the factors that spread the appeal of misinformation are potentially some similar ones, right? We can think of, in this case, there's like some of the anti-vaccination movement is fed, in my reading of the Children's Defense Fund, by some very real concerns about sort of corruption between moneyed interests and government, right? Between the degree to which, these organizations are sort of bought by the industries they're supposed to be regulating, that to me do not read as paranoid, that those concerns are grounded in some realities, right? So I think understanding what are some of the sort of key concerns that are actually true, that sort of make the misinformation compelling, right? The sort of like grain of truth that then makes sort of these false narratives seem more real, I think could be helpful in terms of thinking about both the climate change debate and anti-vax. What are some of the core issues we can address that would then lead that information to be less resonant, right? And also, I think in terms of our sort of new media environments, that the way that these things are spreading in terms of algorithmic curation, segregated media, information silos, that all of those things are sort of common threads across the two issues, though the sort of source, I think, is quite different.
And just to add to that, I think that is very spot on. What we see, so the anti-vax movement is highly networked, participatory, and grassroots. And that distinction between the disinformation that is being pushed into the ecosystem and what of that resonates is really important. Because there are disinformation campaigns that fail because they're just not resonating. And there's also disinformation campaigns that are just entertainment, that are funny, but not, actually leading to a specific behavior change. One of the things that the anti-vax movement teaches us is about who is there when people have problems and when people are seeking help, companionship, and those types of things. Because what happens is like you becoming like every new parent is initiated into should I be vaccinating my child or not from a highly emotionalized stage. And people in this current ecosystem then go to the internet to ask these types of questions. So how many experts are there on answering these types of online questions on Reddit? The number is close to 0. But all these network anti-vaxxers are there, building relationships, answering questions. And it is that kind of trust building that happens over time that draws people into a peer group, into an in-group. And what we're also, or have been seeing over the past couple of years, is that this then translates to other topics. So you might be initiated through anti-vax, but then you're also anti-climate or do not believe in climate change because these issues transfer. And then you get to election sabotaging and all those types of things. So these things have increasingly intersected. At the same time, this is where we can learn how to respond to climate misinformation and disinformation also is, again, by building these relationships and being in the spaces where people are making sense of information. So one of the infrastructure changes that we need to see is that the expert, where the knowledge and the expertise of at least the facts sits in an environment that communicates mostly through news media, which is somewhat relevant, and through ads in a paper that nobody reads. Whereas where people spend time asking questions and forming their belief systems is where everybody else is. So it's not just the journalists that need to get there, it is the experts that need to get back in connection with where people spend time to make sense of the world.
Hi, my name's Damaris. I was previously a high school science teacher, although I did study. I have a degree in climate science and policy, and I'm now working at the state level here in Rhode Island to promote and coordinate STEAM initiatives, the K through 12 level. So all that to say, this is a very meaningful panel. Thank you all very much. I have a comment and a question for you all. So first of all, Matt, I really like how you brought up that the K through 12 practitioners and educators are sort of an untapped resource in a lot of ways for promoting climate action. I was really struck by a similar thought when I went to a social sciences workshop recently. We did a mock sort of stakeholder workshop about managed retreat, and I was really struck by, wow, the same skills that you need to be a facilitator in this space, such as asking relevant questions and keeping people on topic and making sure all voices are heard. That's the skills that a lot of educators have. So that's one thing that is on my mind. A question I have is, just how can we build the capacity and skills in youth to be scientifically literate, media literate, and also the communicators that we need in this space?
Education policy is tricky because we operate within a highly decentralized system. And so, a first initial response may be, well, let's go and look at our state standards, and do they talk about climate science, or do they talk about broader kind of planetary health? And the answer is it's quite variable across states. Now, challenge is that if you focus in on a state like Washington State, for example, they have some more robust standards, but how those standards play out, as you well know, having been in the classroom, is really contingent upon a whole bunch of factors that are the links between that state policy and how the district implements the curriculum that they choose to purchase, and how they support the teachers who are intended to deliver that curriculum to do that effectively. And so I think what a successful approach would look like for helping our children and adolescents to be more science literate is to think about things like what are the curricular materials that we're equipping teachers with to use. And there's actually a huge community of nonprofit and other support organizations that are developing this type of material. But as we've been talking about, the communication of the existence and access is not as successful as we might like. And then states funding support for educators to then feel capable of delivering that. If you look at surveys that teachers fill out about their own level of comfort with teaching about climate science, it's often quite low because their own training that they received, you don't learn anything when you're a teacher in training about climate science more broadly. And I think the kind of unrecognized piece about this is that the ways in which we build accountability systems in education and what subjects we test can unintentionally squeeze out the time it would take to deliver that content in a more robust way, and how we emphasize what we teach and at what levels. And so we have to have a kind of holistic approach, which is, state level standards with investments in curricular resources that are high quality, with support to deliver it through professional learning communities, and time and incentives that are aligned to doing that well.
Yeah, and I think the campus community partnerships, right? So I know that recently we've worked with the Environmental Club at Mount Hope High School, and I think there isn't a lot of time during the day, right? So those out of school times experiences are really critical. The students have rallied around, they did a panel, they invited experts. They weren't the experts necessarily, but they were wanting to hear about the impacts of climate change in our small town, and they learned a tremendous amount by doing and seeing and making connections amongst the panelists. And then also they are participating in, there's a local arts collaborative, and they found some money for creating a film, and the students are helping to write that film. And anyway, so that real world experience, I mean, I think to add to your list of skills and knowledge that they need is that civic engagement. They really need to recognize that they're part of the community. We need their voice. We want their voice, and we need them to participate. So,
amen to that. I forgot to say that the Hesses are awesome. If anybody who doesn't know about them yet, and so is Kristen. I recently asked the senior seminar group of the Harvard undergrads who are concentrating in public health how much time they spent on their devices and on social media. And I think you all know what the numbers are. So I think it's really hard to have an education conversation without thinking about these platforms and how much time students spend there. I had a student crying in class because she realized she was spending on average 11 hours a day. That is more than spent on school. I just to piggyback on what Kristen was saying, I think it's through mental health and agency that we get back there. It is like lesson plans are important, but how do I take care of myself in this environment? How can I take agency back over the content that I consume? And then how can I engage with things that are good for me? And how can I become a creator, since so many of our youth are actually just passively exposed to content as opposed to actively engaging? I think those are all important avenues. And in that context, micro-learning is really important and powerful because there's very good content online, and directing folks towards that and understanding how you can design your own information diet the same way you pay attention to your real world diet, your food diet. There's amazing pilots, and I'm happy to share more about that are happening.
I'm not quite sure. This is a follow-up question to the one that was just asked. I'm not quite sure how to put this in a room full of experts, but one of the things that I feel is sort of missing from a lot of science education is both popular education and classroom education is whatever we can use to sort of banish what I think of as kind of the scourge of I do my own research people. Like, there's a lot of this sort of anti-elitist perspective that has turned into sort of a death of respect for expertise that I think motivates a lot of the anti-vaxxers, but also motivates questions about climate too. I've had conversations with people say, well, isn't oxygen a greenhouse gas? And I'm like, all right, so you should not do your own research. Right? But that is, I think, a real issue that, again, I sort of hesitate to bring up in a room full of experts. But I wonder if you have thoughts about how to frame even what I'm trying to get at, because I struggle with it with people that I've spoken to, and I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, I guess that one thing I would say about that is that I agree that, especially thinking about anti-vax and climate change debates, that there is an amount of sort of anti-expert and anti-elite sentiment that is potentially motivating both the anti-vax movement and also folks who are opposed to action to address climate change. But sort of similar to something you said earlier, my instinct is that one way to sort of deal with this, to respond to this type of misinformation is in thinking about sort of how to generate trust between us, are, the sort of like intellectual and cultural elite, and the folks who right now do not trust us, right? Coming to that from a place of trying to cultivate mutual respect and empathy, and that's potentially through sort of telling stories, focusing on narratives and experiences, right? And trying not to sort of simply hold up our knowledge and our way of sort of understanding the world as the correct one, right? To understand where they're coming from so that there's a sense of mutual respect. Because I think that sort of sense of mutual, like the feeling of a lack of mutual respect is part of what's getting us here to this place. So I think there are sort of these sort of class-based divides in access to knowledge that are creating resentments, that are creating a lack of trust, and that I think it's sort of upon us to try to really get that trust back by generating these experiences of empathy.
Could not agree more with that articulation. I wish for a world where anybody in the community saying I did my own research does not feel intimidating or frustrating to a scientist, and where a scientist can see that this stands not for the kind of deep, rigorous research that gets done in academia, but for a person taking agency and thinking about, well, how can I get information? How can I think about this? How do I have agency in all these things that I'm struggling to understand? And once we flip the conversation away from something that is like, this isn't comparable. And if you imagine and if you imagine being asked this question by a child, where you wouldn't assume intent, or where you wouldn't assume certain literacies that you are hoping for in an adult, there would be a different reaction to that kind of question. And then caring engagement is like, well, let's think about oxygen, and what does it do, and what do these other things do? So I think focusing in on all of these, or when somebody does their own research, that's an opening, because they're trying to think. And we can think together. And how can we get away from, well, let me tell you how that is actually wrong, to what made you think of it? Here's something that we learned. So again, there are entire ways of engaging. I think our educational system is actually really full of them that we can bring back. And I'm bringing it back to the vaccine conversation because we're working on a Rhode Island vaccine project right now. The latest research from the Rhode Island Department of Health is that any and all communications materials in Rhode Island on vaccines should be in a 3rd grade reading level. That's where we at. So coming in, right, this is like, let's be open and let's engage, and that let's understand that people are not liking to be like outsmarted, and much rather will be part of a conversation and for us to help them think.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end. This has been a really great panel. And what I love about it is how much we've been focused on hope and gratitude and what we're proud of, and while we have a lot to do still, we are getting somewhere. We're making progress. So I am going to wind up the conference with a few words. So I just want to say, to remind everybody of the purpose of the conference, which is to really showcase what Brown researchers are doing, both people who are well established in their careers in climate-related topics, or who are just starting in those areas of research, and how we have all learned by doing interdisciplinarily engaged and community-partnered research on these topics. I think we've really come to a very expansive idea of what it means to do research and education on this topic. And so that's very inspiring. And that was the purpose of the conference, is to see how much is happening here and how exciting it is. So we do have some expected outcomes of the conference as well. So for those of you who are already doing research on climate-related topics, we really hope that today's panel discussions have expanded your awareness of what your colleagues are also doing, and how there may be overlap or complementarity in your topics, in your areas of investigation, that could prove fruitful through more conversation or even collaboration. And then there's also a lot of opportunity here to incorporate what we've discussed into your teaching. And I do hope that there are, that people consider some cross-fertilization of topics by inviting other Brown faculty to come and speak in your class and figure out how interdisciplinary works, because after all, that is a signature characteristic of Brown's education. And then for I don't think there are any students left remaining in the room, but, one, okay. Two, yay, excellent. So thank you for sticking around. And I hope that what you've learned today is inspiring and something that you will carry with you in your research careers or in your careers outside of it, the academy, whichever way you choose to go. I just want to, there are things to do after the conference. So one thing I want to bring your attention to is that we currently have a request for proposals for Equitable Climate Futures working groups. You can propose to plan to co-create a climate-related research project that advances equitable solutions by forming a team of researchers and experts from community organizations, government, or industry. If you are interested in forming a working group, please contact myself, Baylor, or Kara Mitchell. I want to just point out that Kara Mitchell is our community engagement specialist. She is the go-to person for best practices on community engaged research. She is formally employed by the Swear Center, and so she coordinates with them, but she is dedicated to ECF. And so she can be a very helpful resource. Any Brown faculty and staff are eligible to be the PI, but that means you should also consider having partners who may not be at Brown. So you can have a co-PI who is from a community organization. You can end these budgets of $20,000 to $60,000 for up to 2 years can include funds to go to community partners to pay for their time, their efforts, their other ways in which they're engaging with you in research that is within the scope of ECF. So there is a intent to submit request that's not required, but we have a deadline of December 5th. If you don't make the deadline of December 5th, send it in anyway. We will still read it and give you feedback. The full proposal is due February 1st, and the submission instructions are on the ECF website. Okay, so I really hope that you all consider doing that. I'm sorry that we will get this out to everybody who attended as well, who may not be here right now. There's also an evaluation survey that we'd like you to fill out. So please do that. And, you know, it occurred to me while we were talking about information and where you get your information from, I don't think we put a question on there about how you learned about this conference. So we can add it. But if you are filling it out right now, just put it into the open response. How did you learn about this conference so we know how to reach the Brown public better? Okay, so that's the to-do list. And I just want to conclude by thanking people. So, of course, thanks to the provost, Frank Doyle, for funding Equitable Climate Futures initiative, and to the IBIS director, Kim Cobb, to the IBIS staff and Kara Mitchell, who all worked together to do a lot of the legwork to make this happen. And this just went out. Okay, I'll move over here. And then thank you to all the panelists and moderators, many of whom have gone home, but especially, you know, for those of you who stayed through to the end, thank you very much. And of course, thanks to media services and catering. It's been I feel like it's been a great day. I'm excited by everything I've learned and all the people I've met. So thank you all for coming.